Have you ever wondered what happens when two superpowers gamble everything on a single battlefield? In the summer of 1943, Hitler believed he had one last chance to regain control of the Eastern Front. But what he didn't know was that Stalin had already prepared the largest defensive trap in military history. So the question is, who was truly hunting who? After the crushing German defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler was desperate. His prestige was shattered, his armies were exhausted, and morale in Germany was collapsing. Yet he refused to accept defeat. Instead, he placed his hopes on a massive offensive plan codenamed Operation Citadel. The target? The Kursk salient, a bulge in Soviet lines that stretched 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep. Hitler thought it was vulnerable. But was it really? The Germans assembled nearly 900,000 men, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, and 10,000 guns. Among them were their deadliest new weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks. Hitler believed these steel monsters could smash through Soviet defenses. But here's the twist, Stalin already knew they were coming. Soviet intelligence, backed by Britain's code-breaking, had intercepted German plans. Stalin wasn't guessing, he was waiting. And so, instead of retreating, the Soviets built layer upon layer of defense around Kursk. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, trenches, and artillery zones. In total, over 1 million soldiers, 20,000 guns, and nearly 5,000 tanks stood ready. It was the most fortified battlefield the world had ever seen. But can even the strongest defenses withstand the might of the German blitzkrieg? Inside Germany, generals debated. Some warned Hitler that the delay in launching Citadel gave the Soviets too much time to prepare. But Hitler insisted, the offensive must go on. For him, it wasn't just about territory. It was about pride, revenge, and proving that the Wehrmacht was still unstoppable. As July 1943 approached, tension gripped both sides. German troops, confident in their new tanks, sharpened their knives for what they thought would be a decisive blow. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers dug deeper, laying over 500,000 mines in the earth. Both sides knew, the fate of the Eastern Front would be decided here. Imagine being a soldier at Kursk, staring across the field, knowing the largest tank battle in history was about to erupt. Would you have felt fear, or confidence? On July 5th, at dawn, German artillery thundered across the front, signaling the start of Operation Citadel. Thousands of tanks and soldiers rolled forward. But just as the Germans advanced, Soviet guns opened up, and their minefields exploded under the treads of German armor. The trap had been sprung. The Battle of Kursk had begun. But who would survive the storm? The ground shook as the German offensive roared forward. At dawn on July 5th, waves of artillery thundered across the Kursk salient, followed by the rumble of thousands of tanks. The sky itself darkened with swarms of Luftwaffe aircraft. It was the most massive German armored assault of the war. On the northern front, General Walter Model's 9th Army advanced, their new Panther and Tiger tanks leading the way. The Panther, armed with a deadly 75mm high-velocity gun, was designed to pierce any Soviet armor. The Tiger, heavier and more intimidating, carried an 88mm cannon that terrified even the most seasoned Red Army crews. But here's the question, were these new machines truly unstoppable, or were they untested monsters rushing into a battlefield of hidden dangers? The Germans pressed forward, but the Soviet defenses were merciless. Mines exploded beneath tank treads, shattering steel and trapping columns in deadly bottlenecks. Anti-tank guns concealed in the fields unleashed devastating fire. Entire squads were wiped out before they even reached the first trench line. Imagine being inside one of those tanks, the metal shaking from every blast. Would you have kept pushing forward, or would fear have made you hesitate? On the southern front, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army struck with even greater force. Here, the Germans achieved deeper penetrations, but every mile came at a staggering cost. Soviet soldiers fought tenaciously, retreating only to new defensive lines. Behind each position lay another and then another. The battle was more than just machines and men. Overhead, the skies erupted in one of the largest air battles of the war. German Messerschmitts clashed with Soviet Yak fighters, while Stuka dive bombers screamed down upon Soviet positions. The roar of engines, the crash of bombs, and the endless crack of machine guns created a storm of fire. Yet despite the chaos, Soviet anti-aircraft fire kept pounding away, denying the Luftwaffe easy dominance. For days the fighting raged. German armor pushed forward yard by yard, but Soviet resistance was unyielding. The minefields and trenches slowed them to a crawl. Every advance seemed to bleed them dry. And still, Hitler demanded progress. He had promised his people a decisive victory. Could he deliver, or was he already walking into disaster? By July 9th, the Germans had made gains but not the breakthrough they needed. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet defense seemed to harden with each attack. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, fields turned into graveyards of burning tanks. The once proud German blitzkrieg had slowed into a grinding war of attrition. And then came Prokhorovka, a name that would forever be etched in history. There, the fate of the battle would be decided in a clash of steel unlike anything the world had ever seen. But could the Soviets hold the line against the most feared armored divisions of the Reich? July 12, 1943. The fields near the small town of Prokhorovka became the stage for one of the greatest tank battles in history. At dawn, the rumble of engines shook the ground as over 800 German tanks advanced, led by the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps. Facing them were nearly 850 Soviet tanks, mostly the reliable T-34s rolling forward in wave after wave. Can you imagine it? Steel against steel, dust, smoke, and fire, tens of thousands of men caught in the eye of history's deadliest armored clash. The Germans believed their Tigers and Panthers would dominate, but the Soviets knew they couldn't afford to wait. Instead of sitting back, they charged head-on. Why would they risk such a reckless move? Because if the Germans broke through at Prokhorovka, the entire Soviet front could collapse. It was all or nothing. The battlefield quickly descended into chaos. Tanks collided at point-blank range, firing so close that armor cracked under the sheer force. Soviet T-34s swarmed German Tigers, circling them like hunters, targeting weak spots in their armor. German crews, trapped in their heavy machines, fired back with devastating precision. Imagine standing there. Would you see it as bravery or madness? Dust clouds choked the air, making visibility almost impossible. Crews often fired blindly, guided only by the flash of enemy guns. Infantry clashed in the burning villages nearby, while artillery thundered relentlessly. The noise was deafening, the ground littered with wrecks. Survivors described it as a living hell, a storm of fire and steel where survival felt like pure luck. By midday, the fighting reached its peak. At one point, German tanks managed to wedge deep into Soviet lines. But the Soviets had reserves waiting, and with desperate counterattacks, they sealed the gap. The T-34s, though lighter and less powerful than the Tigers, were faster and more maneuverable. As the day dragged on, losses mounted on both sides. The Germans destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, but they themselves were bleeding, losing machines and men they could not replace. Every Tiger lost was a blow, every Panther abandoned in the mud a reminder that their technology could not win alone. By nightfall, the fields around Prokhorovka were a graveyard. Nearly 400 Soviet tanks were lost, along with dozens of German Tigers and Panthers. Neither side achieved a clear breakthrough. But here's the truth: the Germans had thrown in their best, and they hadn't broken the Soviet line. And if the attack stalled here, what hope did they have of pushing deeper? For the first time, the myth of German invincibility had cracked. The Red Army had not only absorbed the blow, it had stopped the strongest armored divisions the Reich could muster. But the question remained: was this just survival or the beginning of a turning point that would change the entire war? When the smoke cleared over Prokhorovka, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Hundreds of tanks lay twisted and burning, their blackened shells scattered across the fields. Thousands of soldiers, German and Soviet alike, never returned home. But beneath the wreckage, one truth emerged: the German offensive had failed. The question now was, what would this failure mean for the course of the entire war? For Hitler, the results were devastating. Operation Citadel, his grand gamble, had consumed his best tanks, his most elite divisions, and his last chance at seizing the initiative on the Eastern Front. The losses were staggering: nearly 200,000 German casualties, hundreds of irreplaceable tanks, and aircraft that the Reich could no longer easily rebuild. Could a nation already stretched thin afford such a blow? The Soviets, though battered, had endured. Their losses were even greater in numbers: over 250,000 casualties and thousands of tanks destroyed, but unlike the Germans, they could replace what was lost. Factories deep in the Soviet Union churned out new T-34s at a pace Germany could never match. Reinforcements poured in while fresh divisions arrived to strengthen the front. The question loomed: if the Red Army could recover this quickly, how long before they pushed westward with unstoppable force? Stalin and his generals didn't hesitate. Even as the Germans reeled, the Soviets launched counteroffensives from both north and south of the Kursk salient. Their goal was no longer survival, it was total victory. German armies that had once charged forward now struggled to hold ground. The Red Army pushed relentlessly, driving the invaders back toward the Dnieper River. For the first time in the war, the momentum had shifted permanently. Could the Wehrmacht ever regain the initiative after Kursk? Hitler, furious and humiliated, tried to hide the scale of the defeat. But whispers spread through Europe. The once invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped cold. Confidence in Nazi leadership began to erode, while Soviet morale soared. Soldiers who had once feared the German blitzkrieg now believed they could win. And if an empire built on fear loses its aura of invincibility, what happens next? Historians agree that Kursk was more than just a battle. It was the death knell of German offensive power in the east. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major strategic attack on the Eastern Front. Instead, they would fight on the defensive, retreating mile by mile, until the Red Army reached Berlin itself. Think about it, what if Hitler had cancelled Citadel? What if he had waited, regrouped, and avoided the trap? Would the war have dragged on longer, or was Germany already doomed by the sheer weight of Soviet industry and manpower? These are the haunting questions Kursk leaves behind. The Battle of Kursk was the clash of titans, the largest armored engagement in history, and the moment the tide of World War II turned irreversibly. It was not just a Soviet victory, it was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. So now I'll leave you with this. If one battle could change the fate of nations, what lessons does Kursk still hold for us today? Should pride, technology, or sheer numbers decide a war? Or is it preparation, patience, and resilience that truly win? If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping history that reveals how the past still shapes our world today.